Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Darren Hartley. I'm Chief Executive of TAROE Trust, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our latest Wednesday webinar. Today, we are delighted to be able to re-welcome back Kate Dodsworth, who's the Director of Consumer Regulation at the RSH, Regulator of Social Housing. We'll continue with all of the acronyms. So yeah, really pleased to be here. It's a really topical theme at the moment. Only a couple of weeks ago was the release of the final version of the Tenant Satisfaction Measures. We've got the Social Housing Regulation Bill continue to progress through Parliament, and the various plans for setting up proactive consumer regulation. I know there was a lot of interest in this session ahead of today. A couple of housekeeping things before we get going. We're recording today, so as is the usual way, we'll record it and we'll post it up onto our YouTube channel. Fingers crossed that'll be up later today, and we'll send an email around to everybody as well, just to let you know that that's been posted when it is. We have a chat function again, so we're using the Zoom webinar platform once again. So really would invite you as we go through today's session to make your comments, raise your questions in advance, and I'll try to monitor those so that we can kind of facilitate a Q&A once Kate has delivered the kind of initial presentation. So yeah, and there's the usual functionality there about raising hands. So as we go through, today's going to be a little bit different than some of our most recent webinars in that Kate's going to talk through and provide a bit of an update on things that are happening regulation-wise in the sector. We expect that to go on for about 20-25 minutes, and then there'll be a pause where there's a time for you to ask questions and discuss what Kate said. And then we're also joined by Fleur Priest-Stevens from the Regulator as well. And Fleur and Kate are going to hopefully have a bit, facilitate a bit of a discussion to shape their thinking as well as we move into the sort of development of consumer standards, and in particular what good looks like. So it may be something to bear in mind as we go through Kate's presentation in advance, to kind of inform your thinking for the follow-on discussion which we'll have in the second half of today's webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to hide away in the background. I'm going to hand over to Kate, and I hope it's as informative as I'm sure it will be, as it always is, Kate. So yeah, delighted to welcome you. Thanks.
Darren, thanks very much for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. It's really good to be here with you. I recognise a few of you already from previous sessions. I think, can anyone see me, or is that just a screen that says Darren? For me, I can just see a screen that says Darren. So if you could see me, that's grand. That's all right. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I recognise some of you from previous sessions, and it's always really, really helpful to come here and talk to you. And TAROE, as you know, has been incredibly helpful, continues to be, and will be as we develop the proactive consumer regulation that we've been tasked to do from the social housing white paper. So I think at the last time that Fleur and I were here with you, for those that are at that session, I think we'd just started the consultation on the tenant satisfaction measures, and we certainly got a lot of feedback and input from you at that, and also from the formal consultation from TAROE. So huge thanks from us. This is really, really helpful to do this in sort of concert with you. So I'll start there on the tenant satisfaction measures. The consultation, as you will remember, finished in March. And then we had a long period actually, of cogitation on the results and thinking about what people had sent through. And part of the reason that took a number of months to do until we published a couple of weeks ago was that we had 1,100 responses, 1,100 separate responses to the consultation. And the bit that really, really made us so sort of positive, and I hope it does for you as well, is that 55% of those responses were from tenants. Now, as a regulator, our primary relationship, as you know, is with the landlord. That is quite incredible that 55% of those responses were from tenants. I'll talk through some of the changes, some of the detail, but largely responses were that actually tenant satisfaction measures were in a good place and people weren't proposing huge changes to them. There were some minor changes we've come out with. I mean, if you want to read the document, there's a number of choices. There is a huge tome on our website for you to look at. There's a summary document, which I find incredibly useful. We've also for providers specialising in tenants with learning disability, we've got an easy read version of the document as well. But I think that the summary helps look at what changes we have made. So, for instance, there was one proposal for the tenant satisfaction measures that covered whether a home was well maintained and safe. Quite rightly, people have come back to us and said, look, that's a bit impossible to say through one question whether it's well maintained and safe. Those are two very different things. So we've listened, and that's now two separate questions. So thanks for that. On handling complaints, we've now put a filter question on landlords' approaches to handling complaints to ask if the tenant has actually made a complaint, just because that's important in understanding whether it's the perception of the system or because somebody has actually made a complaint. We've removed the tenant satisfaction measure that measures a tenant's knowledge of the complaint system, just because that's covered in other question and will be covered through the consumer standards. And on the TSM to do with repairs, that now includes emergency repairs as well as non-emergency repairs. So those are just some of the more detailed changes that we've made. Feedback on the whole from the sector, I think that the biggest areas of difference for people were, number one, smaller providers, smaller landlords. We proposed that to reduce some of the administrative burden for those landlords that don't have very many staff, they could send they could do the census survey on tenants every 2 years, and they didn't need to send it to the regulator, but of course publish it to their tenants. There were differing views on that from smaller landlords themselves. Some wanted to show the regulator as part of that process. Some were sort of grateful for the reduction in admin. It's a fine balance to make sure that you're not creating a bureaucratic nightmare for landlords where they have to divert resources away from tenants in order to employ more people to a small outfit. And on the other side, for tenants, these are really important consumer matters. You don't want to dilute it down too much so that those tenants don't enjoy the sort of extra consumer regulation. So we've sort of finished in a fairly middle ground space, but we have committed to do a pilot with smaller landlords to look at what further sort of administration would look like for them. And then the other bit that was causing some sort of, not disagreement, but sort of differing views from some people, is on the survey methods to get feedback from tenants. We proposed that all methods of survey methodology could be used. So by telephone, online surveys, face-to-face. Now, there were some people in the sector that said, actually, you need to be more prescriptive about which method to use, because some methods might yield better results than others. And it comes back to this point of, you know, can landlords get better results by doing something and tweaking the system? On the other hand, there are those that say, actually, for tenants need a whole range of ways of answering surveys, you know, from an equality and diversity perspective. So we've landed on still being flexible in terms of how people can respond to those surveys. And we think that's right. However, we will keep an eye on results as they come in and we will look at those results to see if certain methods are creating better results that don't seem quite right. So we're very wise to this idea of gaming the system, and we'll keep our eye on it. And we will, you know, not hesitate to change and shift if we need to do so. So that's the tenant satisfaction measures. As we've said before, that is not all there is to proactive consumer regulation. And a number of you and other tenant groups have said to us, it's a pretty blunt instrument. It's helpful as a can opener to see how our landlords are performing, but there needs to be much more to proactive consumer regulation. And thank goodness there is. As Darren said, the social housing regulation bill is now going through Parliament. Despite all the ministerial changes in government, that bill has sailed now and it's going through Parliament, and it will have various iterations as amendments are made. But when it comes out the other end of the Parliament sausage machine, we would then get direction to be able to go ahead and start a consultation on our revised consumer standards. And I think that's really important, because that's the next bit of the puzzle of proactive consumer regulation that's incredibly important. Of course, we have consumer standards now where we regulate landlords, housing association landlords only, on a reactive basis, but we're revising the consumer standards to fit against the themes of the white paper, and that will then affect local authorities as well. So the themes of the consumer standards that we will be coming out next year for a huge consultation again on are around engagement, accountability and transparency. It's around safety. It's around quality of homes, and by that we mean, you know, decent home standards right through to how homes are repaired and planned maintenance is carried out. It's around the neighbourhood that people live in, around communal areas, how well those are maintained. And it's around things like tenancy, making steps to prevent evictions, working with local authorities on allocations, and making sure that the tenure is managed legally and properly. So those are the themes, those are the areas that will be coming out on consumer standards. And over again, when we've been out and talked to tenants, and I'm really pleased to say, I think this isn't an exaggeration, we've talked over the last year to thousands of tenants. And you'll have heard me say before, over and over again, tenants are saying to us, landlords would actually go a long way to making some of this better if they addressed repairs and communication really effectively. So the range of areas that the consumer standards cover are incredibly important, and we will regulate those. But just to feedback, the repeated message that we get is around a repairs service and communication. And sometimes, of course, those two things are aligned. So as Darren said, it'd be really good to get your feedback in a short while on how you think we might regulate those. Before we get there, and before we get to questions, I just wanted to give you a short timeline and some thinking around that, and then what we expect landlords to be doing now. And those two issues are overlapping. So on the timeline, for tenant satisfaction measures, landlords need to start collecting data on those from the 1st of April next year, a full year of data right through to March the 31st, 2024, and then publish those results. It has to be a year of data. So landlords need to get busy setting up their systems right now. For the consumer standards, and when we actually go out and do our inspections, as I said, we have to wait for the bill to progress through Parliament and for us to be directed by the Secretary of State before we're allowed legally to go out and consult on those standards. So that will be at some point next year. I'm hoping it will be as early as spring next year that we can start that consultation. We'll then get views, as we did from the tenant satisfaction measures, and I anticipate that we would be going out and inspecting landlords on this new basis from 2024. Now, that leaves us with 18 months. And I've said time and time again to landlords, and I believe that that message is being largely heard, that what we will set up, the way we will regulate, is not something that landlords can cram the night before, like I used to do my homework and tests at school and pass the next day. What we're talking about, and what you've told us, is around large-scale cultural shift. The original aim of the Social Housing White Paper was to move back to core mission and purpose. And I've seen on your website that this is really important to you as well. It's about landlords understanding that new supply and new homes are incredibly important. Of course they are, to people who can't afford a home and need some support. But it's also important to focus on the operations of the landlord, how repairs and maintenance are going, and making sure that people live in good quality homes. And one thing you'd have heard me say before is, I think for boards of housing associations, or for local councillors at local authorities, I think we need to shift back to that being equally as important to the other things that are discussed at board. So one of the things that we are really interested in is understanding how a board or local councillors for local authorities have sight of these things that matter to tenants. So when we're thinking about repairs and maintenance, when we're thinking about complaints and communication, how is it, what's the data that boards will need to see to understand really that they're delivering an effectively good service? I think we've seen a number of examples over the last year or so in particular in the media where this hasn't worked. We've seen some horrendous examples where services and repairs and maintenance have not been as good as they should be. And I think what's interesting for me is how have boards dropped that ball? So what do we need to set up in terms of our regulatory system to make sure that boards see this? Because with the best will in the world, neither us, the regulator, or every member of a landlord's board can go out and impose themselves in everybody's house and look at it. It has to be driven really through data. And I think if boards and local councillors already have lots of information on health and safety compliance data, too right they should, the finances, the sort of money side of it, what's the dashboard that they now need to understand what's going on for tenants through repairs and communication? And that's one of the things that we are really urging landlords to get on top of now, because that's a culture issue. That's something which allows problems to surface rather than a tendency to bury bad news and not let the board see it. These are cultural issues that are going to take time to progress. So I think that addresses the point that we won't be inspecting until 2024 because of the need to change the law. Actually, there is plenty to do for landlords, and that has to be done now. And landlords are hearing that from us time and time again. So the data is really important. The data around tenants and the data around the stock condition, the condition of homes. That's one way that boards can sort of get the idea that things are working well. So I think for us that in just sort of summing up, whatever we do, we have set ourselves 3 tests to be able to make sure that this is working well. Number one, it's got to make a meaningful difference to tenants. Otherwise, all of this is a complete and utter waste of time. We're signed up to it making a difference to tenants. I know you are, and we need to get the sector on board as well. And the signs are good. So it has to make a meaningful difference to tenants. Number 2, it has to be deliverable by landlords. And you will be representative at a whole range of landlords. We have an incredibly diverse sector. There's well over 1,000 active housing associations in England as it is, and they represent all sorts of shapes and specialisms and size and geography. And this is now open to local authorities in England as well. So whatever we do, must be deliverable by those landlords. And the third test is that we have to be able to regulate it. And this is where I'm coming to you for a bit of help, because as I said, with the best will in the world, we cannot get into every single house, but the tenant input in terms of how we regulate will be really important on how we do this. But we have to set up something that is set within defined processes, and our relationship, our main relationship, still has to be with the landlord whilst we get tenant input. So we have to be able to regulate it. So that's going to be a poser to you in a moment, but I'm going to pause there. Darren, hello, and I'll take any questions you have for this bit.
Okay, well, people think of some questions. What we can do is we can either take questions directly in the chat function, or you can kind of raise kind of the subject area that you want to raise a question about, and then we can kind of bring you in. So whilst everyone's having a think about that, I'll kick off, and I've got a few questions which I'll go through. You went through a lot there, Kate. There's kind of a lot for people to process. If I go back to the tenant satisfaction measures first of all, and then we can always come back to kind of the broader general consumer related stuff. Obviously, I think from memory, I think it's 22, isn't there, of the kind of different areas in the tenant satisfaction measures, but they're actually split into 10 and 12 from memory, and that you've got some which are kind of more perhaps better described as performance indicators, and then the others which are a kind of like tenant perspective. So kind of feedback on whether the landlord is good or bad in certain areas. And I think it's probably fair to say that when you've kind of put, because I know we were on the working group that developed it, what you've tried to do is to preempt the kind of the key areas that tenants are concerned about, and certainly it reflects what we saw in the feedback in the tenant roadshows, for instance, back in 2017-18, around how certainly repairs and maintenance and communications, but also some other things around, say, the neighbourhood and communal type areas was a real emerging theme from those things. I am conscious that there are some areas where there's some gaps as well, and that's things like arrears and voids don't kind of form one of the metrics. But those kinds of things will still be collected by the landlord. Landlords are still required to report on some of those areas. So it's perfectly reasonable to expect that you will see landlords reporting to tenants as part of the kind of the new transparency arrangements on a broader range of things. So it won't be just restricted to this to those things. But it's what's in there are kind of the key things. Presumably, I think I know the answer, but presumably though, it's okay for landlords and ideally to work with tenants on developing the kinds of questions that they ask, to add extra questions. And the reason I say that is that when we were doing the consultation and feedback around this, one of the things that we were told, and also what we found in our own direct experience, is things like open questions to say, what are the other things which the landlord can then kind of review collectively, identify themes, and use those themes to kind of inform, because for all the will in the world, you might preempt in the questions what you think is important to tenants, but because of the diversity, as you've just been saying about the sector, there could be other issues which are particular, especially in a locality. So landlords, is it right to think that landlords can kind of develop their own questions so long as they follow your methodology and guidance for these particular questions?
And that's a really good question, and I don't actually know. I'm horrified to say I don't know, and I can certainly come back to you on that. But what you're talking about is sort of additional insight for tenants. So whether the tenant satisfaction measures themselves are a vehicle for that, or whether it's through another means, I think that's quite important. The bit I want to come back to is how we will get our tenant input, because this overlaps with your question. One of the things that we'll be looking at for when we come out and inspect is how we triangulate tenant views with the information we already have. And I think it comes back to your point about the big box, the kind of open question. One of the things that we want to find out from tenants is how they feel about the overall service. And the really sort of exciting bit about our model is how we would use that information when we go in and inspect landlords. So landlords are telling us that everything's fine, for instance, on voids or arrears or any other area. But if we've got information from tenants that's telling us something else, that will form part of quite an interesting discussion. But on your specific about whether landlords use the tenant satisfaction measures as a vehicle for adding in extra questions, I'm going to get back to you on that.
But so one of the things we can do is we can kind of communicate afterwards as well. So that would be good. It'd be really interesting to know that. So I'll go to the chat now, and then I've got some more, a couple of other questions as well. But we'll go to Deb. Deb, did you want to come in, Deb, directly?
Hello. Sorry, let me just turn the light off and try not to blind you all. I just want to ask something. You mentioned, Kate, really interesting, you mentioned about the board awareness and are they aware? I'd argue that actually, are they hiding from the reality of the information that's coming from the bottom up? So, for instance, it's known, but it's rather like health and safety. When you identify an issue or, you know something's going to cause harm, you need to deal with it. So if you don't know, you could say, oh, I didn't know, no one reported it. But it's not necessarily a top not knowing, it's a top not wanting to know, and the bottom not being able to reach the top because of perhaps the layers that exist within an organisation. So that's one, and I know that is a real issue for some, in that how things are perceived is very different to the reality of the everyday experience. The other one was the terminology. Housing associations call their customers, residents, tenants, 1,000 different things, and I think there needs to be some standardization so that those in rented accommodation to whom this applies are aware we're talking about them, and they don't think it's for someone else. They don't think we're talking about another body or a different group of residents or tenants, because it can be very, very confusing to those that engage or we engage with. There was one other thing that came out of what Darren just said quickly. I think you're right about how questions are worded, and I think it would be far more effective if we ask people, are you happy about the state of your windows? Do you have, and actually ask them direct questions about perhaps very key areas of the building's sort of structure, rather than are you happy with repairs? Because one of the things I know from as a work as an officer, that those that have the most profound issues, or are those we're working with in arrears, have mental health issues, are often those that will never ring in for repairs, live in the properties at the worst states. And one of the reasons when we actually engage with them and say, why didn't you ring this in? They say, I don't like to be a bother. I thought this was acceptable. I didn't know you did this. And I thought if I rang in and asked, you put my rent up. So we've got the issues of actually not truly being able to identify some of the worst issues and the worst properties, because those that should be engaging and even have the right to ring in and say it's not, it's broken, will not engage because they are frightened about what comes next.
Deb, thank you. I'm going to just address those 3 points really, really quickly, if I may. I thought your first point was really, really interesting about boards, and I think for us, we are focusing on the outcomes, and I think we will want evidence that boards have their own assurance on these issues. So for whatever reason they're not hearing it, they're going to have to sort out means to hear from sort of the customer voice, because we will be wanting the evidence. And part of what we do already in our regulation on the economic side, which is looking at how the organisation is run and looking at the finances and the health and safety, We ask for a shed load of documents beforehand, before we go in. We then pull the lamp down on the chair and the chief executive, and we start asking them questions. And we will be developing a model that is based around that, with additional input from tenants. So you can imagine the kind of questions that we would be asking based around the consumer standards. And we would want to see evidence in board papers that these issues have been discussed. So whatever the causes of the problems, we will be focusing on the outcomes, and we'll be driving change through that means. But I think that's really interesting. On the tenant side, it is tenants that we refer to, because that was through the social housing white paper that the bit for us to focus on is tenants. So unapologetically, we use the term tenants. I've been in housing for 30 years, working in this field, and I know there's ongoing debates about tenants, customers, residents. I think landlords are going to have to work this out for themselves with their tenants, but for us, we use the terminology tenants because it's straightforward. It refers to what we're sort of tasked to do. And on the landlords and hearing from their tenants, I thought that was a really, really interesting point about, ask people directly, what's the state of their windows like? I mean, we're not able to do that within the confines of the tenant satisfaction measures, because we have to keep them to a certain amount without causing a huge burden. But I do wonder whether the culture change that we're shifting means that tenants are going to have to that landlords are going to have to get out and ask these questions of tenants anyway, because there has to be a shift towards listening to tenants' problems and making landlords more accessible to be able to report those issues. This is a culture shift, and I don't think the tenant satisfaction measures are going to be able to deal with everything, but I think we will get there through the rest of proactive consumer regulation. But those were really thoughtful points. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. I've got one more question before we go into the kind of the other discussions. But I think what Deb has just said is kind of leads quite nicely onto what I'm about to ask, but also quite nicely onto the discussions that you want about the more kind of repairs and comms type issues. So I've been around for a while, and I can remember all of the discussions about setting up the regime under the Tenant Services Authority. There was going to be inspections as part of that process. I think you've been fairly clear with what you were saying there about you're going to look at a broad range of information about a landlord to kind of build up a picture, to triangulate some of that information, and then use that to inform your overall position. Couple of questions then on that, and I guess this might just be that this is all up for discussion and debate as we work through the process. But on inspections specifically, there's already in-depth assessments which take place at the moment, which is based on the kind of the economic stuff at the moment. But as we know, there's going to be, and as you just indicated, you're going to be going out, you're going to be finding out on the consumer side of things. Do you think that they're going to be publicised in advance to know that they're going to be looked? And do you think, as part of that process, because I know this was certainly something which was which was part of the formal process for TSA related inspections, that there'll be kind of a formal announcement to tenants in advance of your visit to give tenants an opportunity to give input into that process, so that you can get a feel, because that has kind of a double. There might be a double advantage to that. Yes, you get direct feedback from tenants, but there's also a knock-on effect for boards in particular, because the boards are going to want to know what the tenants are going to say. So hopefully, if that's part of the process, they might be asking those questions in advance too, so that they get there. So I'll pause on that bit. Do you think that will be part of the process?
So I think you're absolutely right. It's up for grabs in the design of the model. But the important thing that we are saying is I think for the tenant side, the tenant input, there's two elements to this. Number one, I think evidence of a really effective tenant governance system is really good. It implies the landlords are listening, and we can then triangulate to see how far that tenant governance system is influencing the board, etc., etc. That's a really good thing. The bit for us that we need to design is additional to that, and that's how we get tenant input from people who aren't necessarily involved in the running of the organisation, and how you pick up those views. And we have already identified, exactly as you say, it would be incredibly helpful for us before we go to a landlord to hear some of those views. So the design of that is up for grabs. We're not there yet, but we are absolutely aware that just seeing the shiny tenant governance system is not enough. We need to find a way of triangulating tenant views. So we're not there, we're not bottomed out on exactly how we would do that, you know, the means and mechanism for it. But for me, it's an absolutely integral part of the inspection process. And I agree with you. I think it's a double win.
Thanks. Thank you, Kate. That was great. Oh, go on. Yeah, please.
Can I just add as well, because having Fleur here is absolutely wonderful, because she has already been in contact with my wiser colleagues on the tenant satisfaction measures question.
Wow.
Absolutely, yes. Landlords are more than welcome to add in their own questions, as long as they follow the rules and the set process for our original tenant satisfaction measures question. So that's a big fat yes on that one.
Brilliant. Well, what speedy resolution of questions. Very impressive. So we've just, Deb's just asked another one, because we've seen Deb, I'll just take it because I think it's quite a straightforward question. So where housing associations have Facebook site and they have comments open, there is certainly the ability to comment realistically on landlords. So presumably social media is going to be one of the areas which potentially you could look at both in advance or during an inspection process on landlords.
That's a really interesting thought. There's definitely ways and means of triangulating before we go in.
Okay, final one before we go on to the discussion now is just on the inspection point. Therefore, we've been doing some work on this. We've been having some discussions with Shelter as well, and some amendments that have been put forward. This particular one by Lord Best in the House of Lords on the issue of inspections, and we'd supported Shelter's move to make inspections mandatory, and it's probably just worthwhile just me explaining why we thought that. We recognise that there are kind of two schools of thought here. I suspect, just like on the in-depth assessments, you like to have some flexibility as a regulator to be able to kind of move things around on who you inspect based on a kind of a risk-based approach. So if there's potential more risks being presented in one landlord, then you can go to them sooner in order to address the concerns that there may be. I think one of the things that we've pushed for it to be in the legislation, specifically on inspections, was in order to make sure that it becomes a mandatory part of the process. Now, you may say, well, of course it would. I think our point was not directed at the regulator. We've got absolute assurance that we believe that the regulator would be following that process. I think the concerns that we've got is that these things are inevitably subject to the whim of politicians, and that things can change. And that if something is embedded within the legislation, it's much more likely to be enduring than if it is subject to kind of the ability to be able to change things afterwards. So that explains the process as to why we've been wanting inspections to be a core component of the legislation. So it would just be interesting to see how that develops. I don't think you need to comment unless you want to on that. I think it's probably best that you don't. Yeah, just a question there about whether it'll be limited notice like they have on Ofsted.
Yeah, our in-depth assessments are already reasonably limited notice. Having been on the other side and endured one, I didn't sleep for about 6 months beforehand, so that feels a little bit like Ofsted. And yes, it's limited notice. So yeah.
Great. Okay, so I'll be a little bit in your hands, Kate and Fleur, on these questions, but certainly you wanted to know what things were. To have a discussion about repairs and comms and what good looks like. Is this you, Fleur, perhaps?
Go for it, Fleur.
Oh, smashing. I love his surprise appearance in the webinar. So when we are looking at our consumer standards, which are kind of the rules of the game that providers must follow, that we set, and we've got 6 themes that we're looking at, which are going to inform the standards that we put out to consultation in next year. And the 2 themes which are most popular, which are most commonly raised when we come out and we do our tenant engagement, are repairs and communications. And so we thought it would be good to kind of spend some time today, if you don't mind and you're feeling chatty, and hopefully you are. So we've got a couple of questions, and it's really to help us as we design not only the standards, not only the rules of the game, but also how we are going to check that providers are following them. How are we going to check that the rules are being followed and that tenants are receiving the right level of service that we all expect? So where we wanted to start with in this conversation, and I really hope you can sort of like take yourself off mute and join in, is what does really good service look like in terms of a repair service, or what does really good communications look like? And then also, what does really bad look like? And I think we can have a good discussion on this, and probably not let it run on too long, but just to kind of warm us up and get us thinking about it. So what does really good repair service look like? What does a really bad repair service look like? And similarly with complaints, with communications, I always do that. So, you know, and communications spans a broad range, doesn't it? Because communications isn't all just like, look at our brilliant KPIs, have a newsletter. It's often, I'm really sorry we couldn't do your repair on time, or, you know, here's an update on your ASB case. You know, so repair communications isn't always, you know, easy breezy. You know, it can be tricky as well. So what does really good look like, and what does bad look like?
So whilst you have a think, there is a reactions button in the bottom, so you can raise your hand there and we can bring you in, or you can ask to be brought in the chat function as well. Does anyone, is that, we did have a hand up. Yeah, Cyril. Let's see, I think. Let's see.
Am I being heard?
You are.
You are. Hi, Cyril.
I think the important thing about all of this is actually having some organisation at the tenant side of things. We need tenants associations where tenants who are active and interested, and I regret to say in my experience, many are not, to actually maintain the communication between the 2 sides of the business, as it were. So they need support and encouragement, as opposed to possibly, well, if you really want it, maybe. End of story.
That's a really typical theme, Cyril, that you've raised as well, as this, because certainly one of the things where we've had feedback as a charity from residents is over the issue of which voices are being heard, and where landlords have set up, for instance, say, as scrutiny panels and so forth, then they go to those panels which they've set up, but don't always then support or listen, and therefore give voice to the kind of independent tenant associations. Is it fair to say, Cyril, that if there should be an expectation that formal tenant associations do have a role, would that, do you think that would help?
Well, my own view is they should, yes. I mean, many years ago, I was organising a known housing association, I won't name them, and they'd never had one since 1900. That might be a clue. So it was only in the 1980s we actually got something moving. And unfortunately, when myself and others had to resign because of conflict of interest, it all dwindled and withered away. So there needs to be encouragement to keep these things moving. Otherwise, it just become a case of in meetings where I've heard trustees say, we've never heard this before, because the management and the staff, understandably to some degree, will only tell them what they want them to hear.
Brilliant, Cyril. Can we go to Deb and then Maureen?
I was going to come in on the repairs, and I'm going to ask about, because repairs and communications are absolutely key, as we know. But with the push for housing associations to become more sort of focused on the digital forms of communication, what we're finding is with many of those who are latterly to social housing, who have poverty of education, are not able to articulate, you know, always to the best effect, the issues that might be happening in their home or antisocial behaviour, that we find that they're not responding. And often repairs are communicated by text or emails, and there's no way of checking if they're being opened, or, you know, actually they can be received if that individual's got data. And I think what we're finding is that there can be, you know, many messages sent. And let's talk about gas servicing, which will give an example of how you know something isn't working, because until it gets to the stage where we actually send out a neighbourhood officer to knock on the door, because obviously there's a requirement legally to service the gas boiler, we find out that, one, they don't have Wi-Fi, their email's not worked for years, they haven't had connectivity, their mobile phone, they haven't got any data on it. So actually they got none of those messages. And with the constant rush to be digital and to put chat bots onto websites, we're actually excluding more people daily, and it will get worse, because those that, you know, can access social housing are often those that do have lower attainment educationally, don't speak, you know, English is their second language, that we're not building that into this conversation at all. And yet they will say, well, you know, we've got 65 interventions on our customer relationship management system that says we've tried to contact someone, and actually the customer will never have heard from a single one of those communications.
That's really interesting, Deb, and it speaks to this point that we're really thinking about, and it came out in the requirements around the TSMs, and it's something that we're taking through into consumer reg more broadly, is this need for providers to have accurate data about their tenants, to really understand who's living in their homes. Things like the languages they speak, their communications preferences, you know, their access to and confidence using the internet. All of this is really important, and thinking about our standards, the rules of the game. Absolutely, when you communicate, you've got to communicate in a way that people can access, because otherwise effectively you're not communicating with them. So I think that's a really interesting point, and it's something that we are thinking about a lot, and you'll see it in the TSMs at the moment. So thank you, that's a really interesting point.
Flo, we did a session with John Goodman, came from the Housing Ombudsman's Service last Tuesday, so just over a week ago, and one of the things which we were highlighting there was there's the complaints handling code, which now says quite clearly, if something is a complaint, it doesn't even have to be entitled a complaint, and that the landlord should be able to receive that communication through a broad range of mechanisms. So any kind of way that that issue is raised, the landlord should have the ability to be able to take that on and then address it. And in some respects, we're talking about a very similar thing here, aren't we? In that it might not be necessarily a complaint as a kind of a formal complaint, but, you know, a request for a service, if that isn't met, could result in really serious service failures if there's not the ability to make that heard. And that kind of came about from one of the some experiences that we've had supporting tenants through complaints processes, is that where we've seen landlords move to an online portal, for instance. They said, if you want to make a complaint, you can only do it through the portal. But important then, they'll say, we'll only communicate back to you via the portal. And we've had tenants say, well, we can't access the internet, so we can't access the portal, so we don't know when they're getting back to us. Moreover, if they've got anybody who is a kind of an advocate or supporting the person to get through that process, which we have done, they've kind of signed a declaration. They said, you know, we would like TAROE Trust to help us through that process. And we would say, well, we need to be able to access that portal too. They'll say things like, oh, for data protection, we're only able to issue a single user login, and that can't be shared with a third party. Well, they've asked, because of the process, we're helping them through that. Now, fortunately, in where we've worked with an organisation, they've kind of recognised that might be a bit silly. But I'm sure that that's replicated elsewhere, and it's therefore it follows the same sort of principles more generally. Again, it's not just complaints that's going to be a problem for. It's across the board. So, Maureen, you've been very patient. You've had your hand up for a while. If we go to Maureen.
Hiya. I agree with what Cyril and Deb have said. The only thing I was going to add really was that digital. I mean, we get this thing all the time, don't we? That, you know, people don't use it, and there are still people that want face-to-face communication, and that's probably the only way that you're ever going to get what's required out of that, because that's what they need. But what I was going to say was, with good communication and with a good repair service, the only thing I would say is it's got to be honest and clear, and I'm not sure it always is, because we do tend to waffle on a lot, don't we, when we write things. We don't just put it in a very clear way that people understand. I think we've got better over the years, and I think that from the regulator's point of view, I think maybe they should be thinking about making sure that tenants are involved in setting the policy and procedures that they're actually part, that they're using. And then perhaps if they are involved in that, and I know they are in a lot of instances already, but not across the board, that might help, because with the best will in the world, we think it's the best way to do something because we work in the field. We're not actually receiving that service. We can see it ourselves from other services that we actually take, that we know there's a better way. So I think that's my point: honest, clear, and making sure tenants are involved in setting those processes and policies, and how that communication is made across the board. And that's me, really.
That's really
Another add is, I think the other thing is, when we can't provide something on time, sometimes we're not very honest about it. You know, somebody will kind of bury their head away and think, well, if I don't say anything, maybe they won't notice it's going to be a week late. And, you know, we should be ringing people up and saying, I'm sorry, we can't do that now because of this. And it will be a few days late or whatever. So I hope that's
Brilliant, Maureen. I think a lot of what you're saying goes to the heart of the culture of the organisation that Kate was mentioning earlier, isn't it? If you've got an organisation that has a culture that recognises both the importance and value of these things, then they're also much more likely to be honest about it. What we did a session, we facilitated a session, be about last month now, where we actually asked this very question of what does good service look like and what does bad service look like, and we went through that process with staff, and then we went through the process with tenants, and then we brought the two groups together, and we had a discussion to see where the things were similar and where the things were different. And we heard a kind of, it's almost like a case study really, but it was somebody that spoke about their experience, which was really moving, and the room went silent, and it was a very emotional explanation of the experience that this lady had gone through. And what you found was that actually the landlord had done everything that they ought to do as a landlord. So they had met their obligations, but they'd kind of followed things by the book and missed the kind of the bigger picture. And I think that that's where it goes to the culture of the organization. Because really, if you kind of work through, if the organization had been a little bit more compassionate and that they had worked and been a bit more understanding to work with that individual, I think that their experience would have been significantly different. And the actual actions probably wouldn't have been any different than what they had done, albeit they do actually do some discretionary stuff as well, which they could have offered in this case, and it would have been great. And it's really good that they do all of those things. And all of that kind of flows from overall culturally, you know, that I think they're on the right track. But generally, the message that came back is that sometimes if you can show compassion and understanding, which flows from having the right culture, that makes a massive difference to the service, to the communication, and what good and bad looks like. So I'm aware we've had another comment. Endowed. So yeah, Deb's just making a comment there. Deb's just making the point really is that housing associations endowed the housing that's enabled them to grow. So really, they've used the balance sheet strength that they've inherited to then borrow to be able to achieve the growth, and that's underpinned by rents. So I guess the central point that Deb's making is any ability to grow is underpinned by financial viability, which is a result of existing tenants paying the rent. So you know they are central to the ability of the organisation to achieve their strategic objectives. I've got one more question then I'll just ask. I don't know if anyone's got any strong immediate views on it, and that's the role of tenants on boards themselves, because if boards need to be hearing this, we've often had a statement here about, which is kind of a double-edged sword on board membership itself, and it not being sufficient. So I can see Michael's got his hand up. So let's see if we can bring Michael in.
Yep. Can you hear me? Yes, all right.
Yeah, we can hear you great, Michael.
Okay.
And we can see
you. I think there's a number, because I'm going back to Fleur's question, what does good look like? How do we know it's good? I think one of the biggest issues, we forget that tenants don't talk housing talk. We forget that tenants just get on with their life, and then there's a problem, and whatever the problem is, then they talk to their landlord about what that problem is. And they might be talking in a different way than the landlord talks to itself every single day of the week. So you've got to do two things. One, you've got to understand what your tenants are saying and what the tenants are complaining about, if it's a complaint. You've got to have the staff available to actually interpret all the information that's coming in so it's meaningful. It's pointless if you have 10,000 messages a week about complaints and standards and the ability to do your job very, very well, if you haven't got a way of disseminating that and letting the key people in the organisation know what tenants feel. So there's a resource issue there. So it is about organising your organisation to be responsive to what you want the response, where you want to focus your responses. So if it's an organisation who wants to build lots and lots of houses and not particularly interested in doing all the repairs, you've got all the key people in building houses. But if it's the other way around, you've got key people who are interpreting what tenants are saying to the rest of the organisation. And I think that's important. And I think the regulator needs to look at that.
That's really interesting, Michael. Thank you. And I think that kind of brings me on to the next bit of the discussion, which is about if we almost intuitively can understand what good service and bad service looks like across probably all of the standards, if we thought about it, how should boards have a handle on the level of service that is being delivered? And Michael, you talked about having resources and having staff to interpret information that was coming in. So a lot of repairs, a lot of complaints, making sure that board are hearing that. And I think it was Maureen talked about, the need for communication to just be, honest, and thinking about those service standards. How should boards, what information do boards need? What should boards be doing so that they know the service that their tenants are receiving?
So I can see we're quiet, and so I've got a comment which I'll make based on what we've had previous feedback on, and also the thing that comes to mind. I don't know if you remember Raphael Runco, who was the Deputy Housing Ombudsman a few years back. He had an academic background in anthropology. Why is that relevant? So we get quite hung up, particularly in the social sciences, around whether feedback is representative. So how representative is somebody's experience of the general population? And if it's not representative, it kind of says, well, that was kind of like an exception. And what he would always point out was that might not be representative, but the fact that it's happened for one person is really bad, and we need to recognize that they've had a bad experience. But it's also really possible that if it's happened for one person, it could happen for another person. So how robust are your process? What assurance can you get at board level that that's not kind of replicable, so you can't have that again and again and again? So there's something there about the assurances. There's also something about that experience of that individual being valid. And I know Kate mentioned about data and kind of boards having a view on data. I think what I would add to the mix there is that it's also really important that the human personal stories or experiences are also heard at board level. Now that might be in the context of this is not representative, but it's actually, we learn and we experience them through stories. And I think if there was those stories or narratives based on individual experiences are really powerful ways of also then shifting the culture of an organization. So I'd say that whatever mechanisms are in place, it's going to be really important that personal qualitative type issues still form a part of the overall message that boards are hearing.
Darren, I know we've got to finish soon, so I was just wondering if I could just come back on that, and also Maureen's put in Deb put a point in about boards engaging with all staff regularly as well, which I think is aligned to that. And I think one of the points that we're being really careful to make is that boards will not be able to solve the problems that they are there to solve unless they find a route through to talk to their customer service teams, to go and look at the properties that aren't smelling of fresh paint, to talk to the tenants that you've just spoken about, that sort of from Raphael's sort of example. And boards are going to have to find means and ways of getting to these stories and these issues, because one of the things that we're being really clear with them about is if, for instance, you have any differentiation in the satisfaction of your tenants for whatever reason, we will want evidence that you've looked into it, you've understood why, and you've got an action plan for resolving it. And business as usual isn't going to get boards to do that. So I think this is really, really helpful feedback, certainly for us to play back to landlords, but certainly in our design.
It's brilliant. So I'm aware of time. We've not got a lot, but Alan's had his hand up. So if we can just take Alan's question, then that will be the end of kind of this question time. Alan.
Yeah, well, it's very good to have the last question availability on that one. Yes, I think this relationship between boards and residents and the executive is something which is not really clearly understood. in the 20 years that I've been on boards as a tenant board member on that, it has been very, very clear that where you have a tenant representative on the board, and I say representative in a very different way from being a board member, which a board member shouldn't be a tenant representative. That's how it comes out. But nevertheless, what it should be, that tenant representative on the board should be able to have access and talk to the board. I've seen this happen very, very successfully. I've also seen it happen, not happen in actual fact, and it's been complete chaos and misunderstanding down there. The other thing is about board members getting involved. This has always been a clear rule. If you're a board member, you do not get yourself involved on day-to-day things. That, again, I'm afraid, is a wrong misconception. Board members, yes, can get themselves involved. They don't need to be able to go along to a tenant or a problem and say, yeah, this is what I would do or what should be done. They can go along and have a look at what the problem is and then report back to the board as how it may be overcome or improved on that side of thing. Most board members, and again, I must apologise to those that aren't most board members, don't get involved. They come into a board meeting, they have an agenda. It's a question of looking time-wise, yes, this is it. The main concern is finance these days, rather than looking back. There needs to be some different way of communicating within boards between the board members, the executive, and certainly with tenants. Get a tenant or tenants back onto the boards, but not necessarily as a board member. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alan. That's great. Okay, so I'm just going to ask whether Kate or Fleur wanted to come back in with anything there before we kind of sum up and finalise for today.
Just to say thank you, really. Thanks for the contributions. That was really helpful.
Brilliant. Okay. Okay, anything?
Thank you very much. I think we got so much out of that hour. That was incredible. Thank you.
Well, brilliant. Hopefully, everybody who attended today got something out of it as well. So really good discussion. Really great to have Kate and Fleur here today. So that just moves us on to a couple of kind of any other business before we close for the day. We have just a reminder, really, for those that haven't seen this. The government is still consulting on rents, the rents consultation. We've had our draft response up for a while on our website and social media and so forth, and we'll be sending ours in probably later today, actually, which is a little ahead of the deadline. The deadline is next week, the 12th of October, from memory, for that. And that's consultation is just on whether there's going to be, in light of the very high levels of inflation, there's going to be a rent cap applied, and what level that should be if it is applied, and whether it's for 1 or 2 years. Yeah, just a reminder of that. Secondly, we had 2 webinars last week. One from an update on various changes at the Housing Ombudsman Service, and secondly, we had a really topical discussion around an Amnesty International UK report on homelessness and the barriers to accessing housing. Both of those are now up on our YouTube channel, so we can yeah, so please go and visit that. The recording from today will go out, and that will include a link to our YouTube channel. So if you wanted to watch today's back, you can also see those 2 from last week, which moves us on nicely to next week's session, next Wednesday. We'll be issuing joining instructions later today for that. We'll be welcoming representatives of National Federation of Almos, who earlier this year, they published a report on tenant voice. So really looking forward to next week's session on that as well. So with that all said, a big thank you to everybody who has attended today, and look forward to seeing you in our future webinars. Again, massive thank you again to Kate and Fleur as well for giving their time freely for today's session. So many thanks everybody, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.